Hi, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us today for our webinar on how to prevent maintenance strategy deterioration and manage risk. My name is Jeff Talmadge, and I'm an account manager at ARMS Reliability here in North America. My colleague Jason Ballantyne will be your presenter today. Jason is the general manager of engineering at ARMS, managing a multitude of reliability projects taken on by our engineers, ranging from maintenance strategy development and optimization to RAM studies to life cycle analysis studies. We'll be recording this webinar and we'll email a link to the video in the next day or two. So please feel free to share the recording with any of your colleagues who might be interested in the content. On your screen, you should see a questions area in the control panel. Feel free to submit questions throughout the webinar, and we'll plan to answer as many as we can at the end of the webinar. Lastly, we will have 3 interactive poll questions throughout the webinar, and we would greatly appreciate your participation. So now I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Jason to begin the presentation.
Thanks, Jeff, and welcome to anyone, and again, thanks for joining us. We're going to start out today by really asking a pretty simple question, and that's, is your organization typical? And when we say typical, there's some different aspects we can look to see if you're typical, and if the topic of conversation today is going to resonate with what you're seeing. I guess the first bullet point there is, do you have a reliability team in place? However, they predominantly do root cause analysis, and you're still in a very reactive mode. You're still having a lot of surprise events, and that reliability team really isn't achieving the expectations that were set by the organization. The second one there, is your maintenance strategy development approach piecemeal, done in spreadsheets, different applications? There's no one cohesive process to how you define strategy. There's no limited approval of strategy changes, and we'll talk quite a bit about that in today's webinar, the need for that, and that is one of the main reasons why we start to see this deterioration that the topic of conversation revolves around today. I do have some similar assets, but they have different strategies, and then to follow that is, do you know which is the right strategy, and what kind of level of justification do you have for those particular strategies? You have a work management system and a process that allows the strategies and the tactics to be changed without review. You have some areas where things are actually going very well. Those levels can't be leveraged across the broader asset base. We also don't know if what the strategy that was originally defined is actually what's being executed today. So we have this disconnect between our strategy development activities and our defining of the tasks with the tasks that are actually being executed. And finally, when strategy review is done or strategy development is completed, it's done as a project. It's not a process, it's not embedded within the organization, and that reliability team really isn't one that's tied into the decisions that are made around strategy on an ongoing basis. So reflect on, is your organization typical? We're going to give you the opportunity at the end of this webinar to complete a maturity assessment, which will answer some of these questions and give you a gauge for where you fall within the spectrum of typical, but also within the spectrum of reliability maturity. So from that assessment, we found of the 108 responses that we had from that assessment, that over 50% of the organizations that responded, their approach to strategy management is reactive. They have a failure, they then perform some work, and they maybe add a maintenance task, but it's all very reactive. There's not a whole lot of process, there's not a whole lot of continuous improvement. We're really dealing with the events of the day, and our actions are a response to those events, not the other way around, in which your actions are driving the events that occur on the asset. So we're really finding that many organizations fall into this category. So we need to really ask ourselves, well, why is that? These organizations that we're working with that have been doing these assessments are not new organizations. They're ones that have been around for some time. We've got great technologies available. We've got smart people within our organizations. So why are we still in this reactive mode? And sure, there's a culture piece to it, there's an educational piece to it, but the other piece to it that we believe is that we're really seeing this separation of work management and strategy management. However, that's tending to be done together in the one system. So what I want to explore now is the difference between these two, to enable you to visualize what work management is, what strategy management is, and why, if we only focus on one of those things, we will remain reactive in our approach to strategy. So let's first look at one axis, and that axis that we can look at is the effectiveness of the activity. So the effectiveness of the planning and the execution. So if we have poor execution, we can put in some effort, and that effort is by doing work management. We put in place our CMMS systems, we focus on planning and scheduling. That's all work management, and that will provide us with effective execution. Now, the problem with just that focus is that if we start with a poor strategy and poor execution, we end with a poor strategy being effectively executed, and we don't achieve what our goal is, which is to be reliable and to be proactive in our approach to strategies. Now, the reason why people fall into that category is they start using libraries. We adopt OEM plans. There's no process. There's no commitment to the PM content, which falls into the strategy. And we're really not thinking broadly about how we're making our investment decisions in terms of capital and operating expense. And that starts to extend into this as well. So there is another axis here that we need to consider, which is the effectiveness of the strategy itself. Now, in this case, if we just look at our strategy, what we end up with there is the poor execution of an effective strategy. And this is where we need to start to tie these two things together. We can't look at them in isolation. They need to both be performed. They need to both be part of the processes that we have within our organization to be able to improve. So if we do both these things together, we do good work management and strategy management, that will deliver for us the effective execution of an effective strategy, which will drive our predictable performance or our proactive approach to performing maintenance, and will ultimately drive to increased revenues for each of your facilities. Now, how do we get there? Now we're starting to look at optimizing our OPEX and CAPEX spend. We're truly doing continuous improvement, not just talking about it. Our decisions are based on some data, and we're effectively deploying the decisions that we're making. Now, as I introduced that, you probably immediately thought, well, yeah, we're doing some of that. And that's what usually happens. Most organizations are doing one or the other. And they're spending a lot of time and effort to do one or the other, but they're really doing both very well. And that's what we want to talk about today. We want to make sure we're doing both and doing them as effectively as possible. So we'll further look at how that working in each of these two essentially silos will affect things like capacity. So we'll just take a pretty simple example here. Let's look at the daily capacity of a facility as it goes up and down. By improving work management, what happens is we shorten the intervals. We shorten the amount of time that we're out of service by putting in place kits, by buying the right spare parts, by ensuring we're scheduling effectively, ensuring that we've got the details in those plans. We can shorten the amount of time that we're shut down for. And if we do that, that's great, and it gives us some improvement. It gives us an improvement in our outages, but it actually doesn't affect our mean time between failures. We're still having the same amount of events. We're just better at managing it, so it drives our mean time to repair down. Our availability goes up a little bit, our plant capacity goes up a little bit, but we can actually do better. If we look to improve our strategy management, the what we do and when we do it, it'll actually eliminate the failure from happening altogether by doing the right tasks, which has a larger impact on our availability and our plant capacity, whilst also driving the mean time between failures. So we need to combine those two things together. We need to combine work management and strategy management, shorter outages, less outages, to provide us with that predictable performance that we're looking for. So we all start out with this goal of creating a really good strategy, and today's about how does our strategy deteriorate and how does that affect risk. So let's start with the strategy. We all start with an effective strategy being implemented. We all like to think that our initial activity we put forward the best possible strategy that we could have put in place. We financially optimized that strategy and maybe used some simulation tools to help us do that. We also understood risk at that point. We not only optimized financially, but we understood the safety, environmental, operational risks that were associated with that particular strategy. And if that strategy was implemented, we'd be pretty comfortable that we've done all we can from a maintenance perspective to ensure our equipment remains reliable at the minimum cost, but also at the acceptable risk levels. Now, the problem is that our strategy deteriorates over time. It's very difficult to hold the strategy at that effective position because we have new people come into the organization. Or we have existing people that maybe didn't like that strategy that was initially put forward. We didn't get the buy-in that we needed. And in most organizations, they have the capability to make changes to the strategy, make changes to task intervals. And they do that based on their past experience without really doing the financial optimization, without really doing the true reliability engineering that needs to be done to adjust task intervals, which can have a significant impact on performance. But we often go even further than that, and our strategy declines even more, and we start removing tasks that we feel are unnecessary. We start to get feedback that our inspections aren't finding anything, so let's push out the interval. And we hear that all the time, and that's pretty scary as a reliability engineer to hear that kind of thing, because we need to be thinking about things like the PF interval, things like what's our warning time from when it starts to deteriorate to when it deteriorates. We need to be thinking about what's the failure behavior of that asset. We can't just say that because we haven't had an incident, had an event, or seen any deterioration, that we can remove the task. We just can't do that. But we often do. We see it happen in many different facilities that we work in. But at some point, whether it's new management, whether it's a new budget year, whatever it is, we realize that, you know what, we need to improve. Our strategies have got out of control and deteriorated to a point where we're no longer comfortable with the level of performance that they're getting us. So what we do is we improve the content, and we focus on that content of our strategies, and that gets us some level of improvement. Doesn't quite get us back to where we were because we were focused on content, not on the justification behind the effectiveness of the strategy, but it does give us some improvement. After that, our ops schedule starts to influence our strategy, and we start to try to shift things around to accommodate an operation schedule, either to accommodate a target. So we get strategies or tasks that we can't do that this week. We need to push that to next week because we have a goal to meet this week. And that's a very short-term view, and that's often done without really understanding what the level of risk is. And we're again getting further away from what our effective strategy was that we intended to implement. But it happens. So we also improve our strategies at times by adding new tasks. So we maybe have a failure event and we've done what we should do, which is learn from that failure event. And we've put in place a new task. Unfortunately, we haven't gone all the way into that to really understand where we need to make the changes and do we have a task that's just not effective, but we often just put another task in. So after time, our strategy starts to be at a point where it's not effective. We're adding additional tasks that are either duplicates and creating this bloated strategy. We start to incorporate experience that doesn't necessarily align to the particular asset that we're looking at, and our quality of our strategy starts to deteriorate, and we find ourselves in a position where we no longer are financially optimized. We've lost control of that, and we no longer understand the level of risk that we're currently operating at, because we've deviated from where we set out. So we need to understand that. Now, without an asset strategy management process, this change over time leads to unknown level of risk, poor performance, and high cost. And it will continue to do so. We can do another project and we can improve it, but over time, the same thing will happen. And unless we set and put in place a process that prevents this deterioration from occurring, we're going to just repeat this cycle over and over and over again. So we need to stop that. So at this point, we're going to do a little poll. So the poll here is around how closely do you monitor the compliance of your maintenance strategy execution? So do you never do it? Do you never check to see how things are connected? If we're doing what we said we're going to be doing, do we sometimes do it? Do we do some kind of piecemeal review of that? Do we have some process where we can do it most of the time to check that what was being defined to be executed is what's being executed? Or do we always do that every time? So please go to the poll in the GoToWebinar window there. Like your responses. The poll is now open and live. So we're going to leave that sit for a couple minutes here, or maybe not a couple minutes, maybe 10, 20, 30 seconds. So we'll see how many people we get replying, and then we'll close out that poll and just look at how typical are we, and are we all in the same place. So we've got about 60% of the people voted so far. So let's get a few more responses and then we'll close this out. All right, Provan's got 75% of the people have voted. So let's close it out there. If we can close it out there, Jeff, and display those poll results. So what we see is what I kind of expected, that about a quarter of the people say they never really do it, and it's very difficult to do, so we just don't do it. We have some people where we're doing it sometimes. We're trying to do maybe a sample set to make sure that that's being done, and maybe we do that on our critical assets. Maybe we have a small process around that helps drive where we look at. 10% of the people said they do it most of the time. So they're pretty confident that what they set out to execute is what's being executed. And we have nobody that does it always. We have nobody that can ensure that what was executed is actually what's being executed, and no real-time monitoring or triggers in place. So that gives us a bit of a baseline for who we've got in here today and some of the challenges that most organizations will face. So I believe we've got one more poll question. So let's open up that next poll question. The next poll question here is, are the task or plan intervals changed in your CMS without approval or justification? So can they be changed? Are they changed often based on some simple CMS permissions? Do reliability engineers get in there and change intervals, but there's really no formal process? Do you not allow it to happen except for a reliability engineer who can follow a process, or do you not allow intervals to be changed at all? And we're just focusing on one particular element here. So we're focusing on task or plan intervals. How easy it is for those to be changed, and is there any kind of a process around those? So we've got about half the people jumped in pretty quick here, and we got the reliability engineers can do it, but there's really no tracking process seems to be dominating here. But let's give it another few seconds and see if that turns around. Okay, so it did a little. It dropped in terms of it became a little more even. So let's close that poll out and display those results. And you'll see what we're looking at here. So we got 25% of people often make intervals with no real approval process, and we're just doing it based on CMS permissions. We have 30% say, yeah, it sometimes happens, but the reliability engineer does it, which is obviously a step in the right direction. Rarely, so only reliability engineers, which is great. And for those people that fall into the last category, never, that's outstanding. The fact that you have a formal process that drives interval reviews will ensure that those subject matter experts, namely the reliability engineers and the discipline engineers, are involved in those decisions. And that's where we want to get to. We want to get to allowing that to happen, but allowing that to happen in a very efficient way. So Jeff, let's close out that poll. We'll move back into the slides. As we move into the slides, let's talk about strategy governance, which is really what those poll questions are about. So what we've found, we've done this in the past, that 52% of organizations, almost half of the organizations, do not know if the agreed strategies are being executed. And on top of that, 40% of organizations allow for plan intervals to be changed without approval or justification. This group we have here today, you're a little better than that. But I think we still have an opportunity to improve in that space, improve in how we control or govern changes that are made to our strategy, which can impact our performance. So if we look at that challenge, it's often a lack of a formalized process that dictates that ability to make these changes. We often have no restrictions on the ERP system, and people can make those changes, and we're hesitant to put any restrictions on our ERP systems because we fear people aren't going to want to use them. We don't have defined rules on how maintenance tasks are defined and grouped, which means our execution ends up being a little different. And then we lack visibility into the execution. It's just difficult. It's difficult to draw a line of sight between the strategy that was defined by the reliability engineer and the strategy that was being planned, and then the strategy eventually that's being executed. So we need to create that line of sight to allow us to improve. So that's what we're looking at. That's the challenge. We need to make sure that we're putting in place this process at all levels of our organization, from the site to the corporate teams to the management teams, to enable that to be supported. So the challenge number 2 is that we all try to manage our maintenance strategies within the CMMS system. We try and blur those lines between work management and strategy management and use our CMMS system to do all of that work. And why do we do that? We predominantly do it because we lack any other tool or awareness of a tool to be able to do that. We don't really realize the need for it until it's too late. And we also have, again, an easy access to our ERP systems. And this process of creating and deploying generic content is an attempt to do that within the CMMS systems, but it can't be done effectively because these systems are designed to execute tasks, to execute a strategy. They're not designed to be able to develop, maintain, and manage that good strategy. So the secret of a successful strategy lies beyond our CMMS's ability to deliver reliability. It'll deliver a part of reliability, but we need to look beyond that, and we need to standardize on our process for strategy management so that we can generate something once, use it many, and create that line of sight throughout our organization from reliability engineering all the way across. And to do that, we need to be able to separate maintenance strategies and the management of those from the execution of those particular systems. We often try and do it on spreadsheets. That's an attempt to do it. You're headed in the right direction, but spreadsheets are really difficult as we start to look at the enterprise elements of an organization, having multiple users. How do you control it? How do you track what gets changed? That becomes very difficult. You end up with multiple spreadsheets, and anything outside of a very simple system becomes difficult to do with that particular process. So we're going to jump into another poll. So poll question number 3, and the last one for today. Do you review and update your maintenance plans regularly based on the performance feedback that you're getting? So let's open up that poll and let's see what we get today. All right, so let's see what results we got here. So if we look at it, and Jeff, you can close that out and just display those. Thanks. So what we see is that 9% don't review strategies at all. They haven't really changed since we put them in the CMS. We have sometimes, so we do some review. It's not really a process. It's a little bit ad hoc. We got 28%, so they do it most of the time, fairly regular reviews, always based on failure, which is good. And we got nobody that says they always do it. There's no really regular review with agreed triggers, and certainly no formal process. So let's close that out, Jeff, and let's get back to the slides and let's see what we see typically. We see typically that 61% of organizations don't have a formal process. So pretty close to what we found today. I think going back here, I'm looking at it and I see 63% don't have a formal process. So we're all in line with that, not having a formal process or regular review of our strategy. So our strategy quickly becomes out of date, it quickly deteriorates for not only the reasons I explained earlier, but also all of those environmental and business reasons that drive our strategy to actually deteriorate. So we don't have the trigger to be able to drive the strategy review. In other words, there's nothing that really initiates the review to occur. Sometimes people do it on major failure, but that's kind of happening in a reactive sense. There's nothing that's triggering that in a proactive sense to try and improve. We have limited to no formal process to manage and review the evolution of strategies or the content of those. We don't have any metrics or accurate data to successfully review, benchmark strategies to identify areas for improvement. We have this belief that our OEM recommendations are the best strategies. And that's often not the case. We often find they're actually suboptimal strategies. They're not tailored for your operating context, and they're quite generic. We have a reactive maintenance culture, which we touched on very early on today. We have this reactive culture where people don't want to change, and they have this mindset that just fixing things when they fail is the most effective way to perform maintenance. So as reliability engineers and maintenance professionals, it's our responsibility to educate those people, to show them and to provide a level of justification of why we should be doing things differently. And then the last one is this perception that doing strategy review is very time and resource intensive. And to be honest, in the past it was. And I think that's really what's changed. Our ability to do focused review is not nearly as time intensive as it used to be. And we have the ability to make some big gains in that space. So if you've not reviewed or updated your maintenance strategies recently, or worse, you don't have a defined process, your strategies are likely out of alignment with the current assets, the current performance targets of those assets, and the business objectives you have in terms of a cost of downtime and how you're running. So the maintenance strategies that you execute, it's really one of the single biggest contributors to performance. It ensures that we achieve what we need to achieve, but to do that, we need to make sure our strategies are up to date so that we can meet those particular targets. So the way we see it, there's kind of four groups, four different ways that we can prevent this deterioration from happening. And I'm sure you're already aware of what some of those are just based on some of the poll questions that we've been doing, some of the conversation up till now. But let's look at the first one, is we need to implement a strategy change management process. So we need to be able to lock down those permissions to prevent people from changing strategy who don't have the understanding of just how that will affect performance. We need to have any changes that are being made to be justified and are driven through a change management and defined approval process where we can document the reasoning behind the change. So this strategy change management process becomes the first step in ensuring that you don't see that deterioration. And on the flip side, you actually see an improvement or a sustainment of that very effective strategy that you initially put in place. So next up, we don't have and we need to set up formal triggers and a formal process around when and how we do strategy review. We need to be notified. We need to be notified in real time when a strategy is out of alignment with the objective of the organization, when it's not meeting the reliability and availability targets that we have. And we do that through setting up this formal review process with triggers and notifications. And there's a number of different ways we can do that we can set up that trigger. And there's some simple things like where we've had a failure event. And when we have that failure event, if it's a certain level of event, it triggers a review of the strategy that took place. So there is some means to be able to set up that process, but in most times we do it in an ad hoc fashion, and there's really no formalized process, and that's what needs to change. We do need to also measure the strategy effectiveness. So if we're going to improve our strategy and prevent this deterioration, we need to be able to see how well it's currently working. We need to be able to identify some key metrics that are both lagging and leading metrics to be able to tell us where we're headed, as well as where we've been. We need to set some benchmarks. We need to monitor performance, and we need to identify and leverage those pockets of strategy excellence. And we need to be able to fix those ineffective and poor strategies very quickly. And we can't afford in our organizations today to have strategies that are not performing, because they are costing us money to do, and there's potentially bringing us extra failures rather than preventing the failures from occurring. So we need to be able to manage the effectiveness of our strategy so that we have a baseline that we can improve against. And finally, we need to enable the rapid deployment of strategy updates. In some of the other webinars that we've done, we've talked about the amount of time it takes from the analysis and of the generation of a solution or an action or a new task to get that from that analysis position into our system to be able to execute that. And how do we communicate that change to the rest of the organization is all about rapid deployment and strategy update. The quicker I can get that to every asset that has that same situation, the quicker I can start to realize the benefits of that, as well as I can start to remove some of those ineffective strategies that I have in place. So we need to implement this process solution that enables that fast development of the updates without these 1, 2, 3, 6, 12-month lead times between analysis and execution, because it's not until you get that strategy executed or get that solution executed that you'll start to actually realize the value from it. So enable rapid deployment of updates. So what is asset strategy management? We've covered it somewhat already today, and you're starting to see a distinction between asset strategy management and work management. Asset strategy management is a best practice approach to managing asset strategies organizational-wide. It's not just how we manage a strategy on one particular asset. It's also a process that is enabled by people across our organization, enabled by some technology, uses our data to ensure that we are putting in place the optimal strategy on every asset all the time. And that's what we want to be able to do. That last statement, we need to be able to deploy the optimal strategy on every asset all of the time and have confidence that that strategy is going to be effectively executed and not deviate from that and not deteriorate over time. We need that strategy to be optimal all of the time. And through asset strategy management, you'll start to realize the value of the strategies and your asset management program by managing risk and opportunity in order to achieve this balance of cost, risk, performance. And that's really what we're always trying to do. We don't have infinite budgets. We're always trying to balance. So we want to balance that with some with some process, some framework around how we come up with the decisions that we do. Now, a lot of people have attempted ASM in different ways over the years, but ASM is not a task library. It's not a one-off library, and it's not fixed. It's not an FMEA library, because an FMEA library doesn't consider operating context changes. And finally, it's not a maintenance strategy development or review project. A project ends. A project has a dedicated project team that comes together to achieve a deliverable and a milestone in a certain amount of time. A process incorporates people across your organization on a continual basis to allow you to make sustained improvements that don't need to be done as one-off project type exercises. So a defined process with accountabilities, you have the solution and a workflow around how that process ties all of your organization together is what makes asset strategy management successful and not a project. So when we look at asset strategy management, we can't forget the other elements, the other components to a world-class reliability and maintenance program. All right, we have asset strategy management, which we've talked about, but we also have asset performance management. Let's not get that confused. You still need that at some level. You still need to do some condition-based asset health analysis. We need to do that type of work to understand our asset condition. We also have our work management, which we've talked about, surrounded by people that all of this ties together. And when we have a focused effort to do all three of these pieces, we'll be able to achieve the levels of performance that we're looking for as an organization. Asset strategy management, asset performance management, and then work management, all doing the best of what they do. Work management is executing task, performance management, understanding condition, asset strategy management, manage the actual strategy and intervals and the content that goes into the execution through work management. So they're tied together. We need to start thinking about them as separate activities to enable us to prevent this deterioration of our strategy, to prevent us from finding ourselves in this position where we don't understand the levels of risk that we're currently operating at. And every night when we go home, we're not really sure if the phone's going to ring that day, if we're going to be able to get through that night, if we're going to be able to make it to the next shutdown interval. What level of confidence do you have in your strategy today, and need to reflect on how you got there. So to round this out, we've got some benefits of asset strategy management. We have optimal digital strategies. We have a standardized process. We have a centralized system. We see some improvements. We have rapid strategy deployment. So we have a strategy that can quickly understand who else can be affected by a change that I'm making here in isolation. Where else can that change be made? I'm enriching my master data, and that's a continual process. But master data is important. We can't forget about having really good master data. We're driving our decisions based on some data, and your day is not going to be great. I get that, but it is something we need to look to improve as we move forward, and we need to be able to make decisions based on the information we have available at the time. Now, asset strategy management also gives you this effective governance. It allows you to gain control, consolidate spreadsheets and multiple sources of the same data. It allows us to maximize value, and also allows us to benchmark across other parts of our organization, because we're all doing things the same way through the same process. And this is some outcomes that we've got from implementing asset strategy management. We get availability improvements because we're putting in place better strategies. We're managing and understanding risks and reducing risks by putting in place the right maintenance activities and ensuring that we have the visibility and the management of those. We're able to reduce costs. We're able to eliminate the over-maintenance, eliminate those strategies that are not effective. We're able to increase our productivity, which isn't about the productivity of our process. This is our productivity and our efficiency of performing continuous improvement and reviews of our strategy. It also leads to less reactive maintenance. We all want to get to this point where we're proactive, but to do that, we have to take a step back and create these processes that will enable us to truly be proactive as we move forward. So we've got some time for questions. So there is that question pane. I'll take a moment to review the questions that we've had come in here, and Jeff, if you can help me with the questions here. We'll take a moment to answer those. So if you have any questions, please enter them through the GoToWebinar pane, and we'll get to be answering some of those.
Great, thank you, Jason. So yes, a couple questions coming through. For starters, we have, for a lot of assets, there's no historical maintenance or reactive data. How are you able to determine if the result of the strategy review is reliable?
Yeah, it's a pretty common question and concern, is that we need to start somewhere. We can't wait until we have more data, because more data for a reliability engineer means more failures, so we can't afford that to happen. But we want to put in place a strategy and have a level of confidence that it is going to achieve what we need it to achieve. What we've found is the best way to perform that to gain some confidence is to try to validate based on what you're currently doing and how you're currently performing. So validate based on maybe maintenance budget, validate based on how many spare parts are we using, validate on some of that simple, more high-level data that you have, that your strategy is actually matching, or the model that you've created is actually matching. And from that point, you can start to improve the strategies. And once we've got the strategies improved through the process and the metrics that we have in place, we can ensure that remains effective going forward. And we need to create this process that will feed off additional information as we receive it, and be reactive enough to allow us to make changes to our strategy as we need to in a very timely basis.
Got another question here for you, Jason. If we implement an asset strategy management program into our organization with a large number of assets, when will we start seeing results?
Everyone wants to see results quickly. It's kind of a pretty common expectation. And you will see some. So you'll see, if you start to focus on some of those poor performing assets that are failing quite frequently, we can start to see some improvements pretty quickly, depending on kind of the life cycle of the component. When I say quickly, I expect that you're starting to see some improvements within the first 6 months of doing the activity. Beyond that, though, these programs can take multiple years to really see full value. But the important piece is that you're continuing to find value over that particular timeline, which you will. So continue to find value, continue to promote the value that you're finding, so that we can remain focused on the end result, which is a sustainable process that is going to live on with the organization long after the individual is gone. So it's you'll see some short-term gains, and maybe a pilot study is a good place to start on a problem asset. Expand it out to the larger picture, and you will start seeing some improvements. 6 months, but then also all the way out to 3 to 5 years, you'll be still realizing some improvements on some of the longer life components that you have within your facility. We've seen this process used for organizations with over 1 million asset tags. So the process is scalable from 1 million all the way down to organizations with 5,000 tags. The same process can be applied, and we can really realize some value on both sides of that equation.
Excellent. Looks like we have time for just one more question. So Jason, what are your thoughts on specific strategies for critical equipment and generic strategies for common or lower criticality equipment?
Yeah, so it's not a bad approach. We have to start somewhere, and we want to be able to prioritize our resources to those critical assets. So it's not a bad starting point. The warning I would give is that we need to also understand who's not performing well currently. If I'm currently performing very well and my likelihood of failure is low on a critical asset, it probably doesn't make sense to do a full review of a strategy that's seemingly fairly good and fairly solid. But if I need to start somewhere, I'd start on the high critical assets. I'd start on the high critical assets that are causing me problems, and I would do a full review. I would do a full RCM type review because that enables me to really understand operating context. It allows me to do the justification that I need to change maybe the current philosophy that I have around those assets. It allows me to understand risk. Allows me to be able to communicate that risk or that residual risk, enables me to understand where I need to maybe make a change that's outside of the strategy itself. So there's a number of reasons why that makes sense to do the detailed analysis on the high critical. For the low critical, yeah, it's a simple maintenance task analysis, an FMEA, a templated type approach also works because you're less concerned about the consequence, but you do want to put some form of a generic strategy in place so we can do that.
Thanks, Jason. And it looks like we actually do have a little bit of time to take a few more questions. So one kind of related question to that one, Jason. What is the best approach to beginning a strategy review, i.e. what should be done first to ensure the review effectively addresses value loss, such as FMEA?
Yeah, so I think it's definitely related. It's really a combination of that. We need to understand criticality of our assets. If you already understand criticality, we then need to understand where the bad actors are and start that strategy review process on those and define the process that you're going to put together. Prove that process through a proof of concept or a pilot, and through that first exercise and that activity, you'll start to realize some gains, and then you can take that to the rest of the organization. You also want to ensure that your resources are being used effectively. So you don't want to focus those review efforts on assets that nobody sees as important. We need to focus on those that are important to ensure that we are addressing that value loss. FMEA is a good process. RCMs are probably an even better process for those high critical assets, but there does need to be some rigor around how you define the activities and how that review is completed. So, yeah.
And then last question for our webinar today. Is there a relation between the number of assets and the number of employees necessary to implement asset maintenance strategy?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it's less about the number of employees, and it's probably more about how your organization is structured. To get the most value from asset strategy management, there needs to be a few levels of approvals and governance within your organization for strategy. If it's just a singular individual that's developing the strategy and can approve all the changes and deploy all the changes, you need less of a process because you're just one person. The more people you get, the more important it is to have a process so that everybody is doing things the same way. I don't know if there's necessarily a minimum number, but you certainly need at least a couple of levels within the organization that are involved in strategy development. Now, on the other side of that, number of assets, for this process for you to get the most value out of this process, what's important is you have similar assets. If you have one of everything, the value you get from being able to deploy to multiples is all of a sudden gone. But if you have 10, 100 of a very similar asset, you can very quickly improve across the board on all those assets by using an asset strategy management process. So similar assets becomes important when we're talking about number. The more the better. In terms of number of employees, you need to have a process that can accommodate some approvals that don't necessarily happen with one single individual. So that's what I would say there.
Great. Well, thank you again, Jason, and everybody for taking the time today to join our webinar. As I mentioned towards the top of the webinar, we will be sharing a link to this session for you to be able to share with any colleagues or other folks that you know that would be interested in the content. Again, if you have any more questions related to what we've discussed today, we will also provide you with some information in the coming days to be able to follow up and ask any questions that you have. So with that, thank you again, and everybody have a wonderful rest of your day.